both are co-sponsoring this event. So we're delighted to do this with them. I'd like to also just thank the Reserve Officer Association headquarters here for putting us up, and for everybody for coming, and our wonderful panelists that you're going to hear from. When we were thinking about this forum, I thought about a book I was introduced to by my colleague and friend, Admiral Dave Titley, and I don't know where Dave is, somewhere. There you are. And it was a book written in 1982 by Captain John Trimmer. It was called How to Avoid Huge Ships. The book gives advice on the appropriate avoidance actions when confronted by the nearby presence of huge ships. It's basically a maritime operations guidance book for operators of small private boats that wish to avoid huge ships like freighters, naval vessels, etc. But it attracted a lot of attention, I don't know if any of you have heard of it, but at the time, in 1982, it attracted a lot of attention due to its title, which a lot of people found to be humorous. Because avoiding huge ships, it would seem, shouldn't require a lengthy guidance book. And so, but apparently, that's not the case. And as we've learned with climate change issues, that's also not the case. The truth is, though, we've seen the climate change risk looming on the horizon for many decades across both Republican and Democratic administrations. Going back to the first Bush administration, our senior leadership, including the president, has been very cognizant of the future risks of climate change, the same throughout the 1990s. Fast forward to the second Bush administration. In the first term, the George W. Bush administration recognized the security risks of a changing climate. Then we saw in 2008, for example, a worldwide threat assessment released by the National Intelligence Council, also identifying the security risks of climate change. During this administration, we've seen a lot of assessments along these lines and strategic documents identifying these risks, et cetera, leading up to most recently National Intelligence Council Director James Clapper describing climate change as an underlying meta driver of unpredictable instability. A bit of a mouthful, but I think it's a sort of significant assessment. But in the face of these warnings from the security and intelligence communities, the question we want to ask and hopefully give some answers to today is, what have we been doing to avoid this sort of huge ship of climate change that has been on the horizon for quite some time, and what do we do about it? And despite a general lack of public knowledge, the Defense Department has been doing a lot. The Department of Homeland Security has been doing a lot to deal with this issue, the Department of State, and other departments and agencies as well. After all, we don't have the luxury of picking and choosing the threats we pay attention to. It's not we either focus on climate change or North Korea's nuclear weapons capability or China's actions in the South China Sea. It's all of these things together. And how does climate change interact with our existing security risks as well? So these are things we have to pay attention to, and the security community has to pay attention to. We have to walk and chew gum at the same time. So that's what we really want to focus on, is how do we look at climate change as a security risk as we do other security risks in the security landscape. Now, this forum is designed to offer some practical answers from distinguished leaders in the retired military and national security community about how we might go about avoiding this climate shift, dealing with its wake, and seizing the opportunities that follow. And that'll come in the form of the release of 3 reports and 4 panels featuring military, national security, and foreign policy experts from 4 distinct groups. The first panel, which I'm calling the problem panel, is a panel made up of the Center for Climate Security's military expert panel, who put together a report on sea level rise and its effect on the U.S. military's mission. So we're going to talk a lot about the risks associated with climate change, some of the direct risks to our military infrastructure, and there's some solutions in that report as well. But they're going to lay out some of these direct risks. The second panel is going to be focused on the release of our Climate and Security Consensus Project Statement, which is sort of the big solutions panel. And that's going to be made up of a number of retired national security experts from both sides of the aisle who are going to talk about how climate change is a strategically significant risk and that the U.S. needs to do something comprehensive about it. So that'll be the second panel. Then we'll break for lunch. Third panel is going to be sort of the operating guidebook panel. The Climate and Security Advisory Group has put out a briefing book for the new administration, so that really gets into the weeds. We're probably going to step back and talk about the broader implications of those recommendations, but you can read the full book today if you want. It's in the back. And then the fourth thing we're going to do is a little bit more fun, maybe. Though it's probably grim viewing, but we're showing a film, and this is sort of the see it to believe it panel. The Age of Consequences is probably one of the it's the best climate and security documentary I've ever seen. Haven't been many, but it's a really good one, and we hope you stick around for that. And before that that screening, we're going to have a panel of speakers who are in the film, just give a preview with not too many spoilers about what's in the movie. And then at the end of that, we're going to have a reception, and we're going to have that until about 6:30, and we hope you all stick around for that. So now I'll turn the floor over to a whole string of much smarter people, starting with my co-president from the Center for Climate and Security, Caitlin Morrow.
I could have jumped up this, but I didn't want to fall. Thank you. So the first panel is going to be the Military Expert Panel Report on Sea Level Rise and U.S. Military's Mission. This is the brochure of it. You can find the full one online at climateandsecurity.org /military expert panel. This panel will be moderated by Joan Vandervoort. And so the top line conclusion of this report is that sea level rise risks to coastal military installations are already being experienced, are likely to increase significantly throughout this century, and present significant risks to U.S. military's mission in terms of readiness, operations, and strategy. So with that, I'd like to ask the panel to come up, and I will introduce the moderator. So here, this panel will be moderated by Joan Vandervoort. Joan Vandervoort has over 25 years of experience in compliance and sustainability issues at the international, federal, and state levels. Before retiring from federal service in May of 2014, she served as the Deputy Director for Ranges, Sea, and Airspace in the Office of the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Readiness. Ms. Vandervoort served as a Senior Advisor to the Directorate of Army Training on encroachment impacts and as the Integrated Training Area Management Program Manager with responsibility for the long-term sustainability of over 7 million acres of maneuver training land worldwide. She's currently working as an independent consultant. Joan, take it away.
Thank you so much. As you can see from the agenda, and the climate change and national security issues are continuing to grow. And one subject of those issues is sea level rise. It's not only a concern to the scientists, but also to the services as well, and more than just a concern, something that we have to do something about right away. Important questions remain to be answered, and what I wanted to do this morning was introduce this illustrious panel and distinguished members who actually worked on the report, and they authored this report. And what they wanted to do was take a look at climate change and sea level rise in order to assess the effects of this happening simultaneously across the military, both domestically and globally. So I will start by introducing my panel members. And on my left, I'd like to introduce retired General Ron Keyes, who retired as a 4-star general in November of 2007 after completing 40 years of service. Among his many accomplishments, he was a command pilot with more than 4,000 flying hours in fighter aircraft, including more than 300 hours of combat time. He also served as the Director of Operations for the European Command, Commander of Allied Air Forces Southern Europe, Commander of the U.S. 16th Air Force, and the Commander of the Air Combat Command. Next, we have retired Lieutenant General John Castellaw. He is now he is now currently the president of Crocker Policy Institute, a non-policy policy and research organization chartered in Tennessee. The general served in the Marines for 36 years, holding several operational commands and flying more than 24 different aircraft. His duties included service with the UN during the siege of Sarajevo, command of a U.S. joint force in a multinational security and stability operation in East Timor, as well as the chief of staff for the U.S. Central Command during the Iraq War. My next panelist is retired Vice Admiral Robert Parker from the U.S. Coast Guard. He served 35 years as a commissioned officer in the Coast Guard. And a career cutterman, Vice Admiral Parker commanded 3 Coast Guard cutters during 12-plus years of sea duty in various missions in diverse environments, including the Pacific, Gulf of Alaska, Bering Sea, North Atlantic, Caribbean, and the Gulf of Mexico. He was last posted as the commander of the Coast Guard Atlantic area, where he served as the operational commander for all U.S. Coast Guard Atlantic missions within a geographical region that ranged from the Rocky Mountains to the Arabian Gulf. Next, we have retired Rear Admiral Jonathan Way, who is now president and CEO of the Ocean Leadership Consortium. He was commissioned through the Naval Officer Candidate School in '83 and served for a surface warfare officer for 4 years. He joined the Navy Oceanographers community in 1987 and had numerous operational assignments at sea and ashore. He commanded the Naval Training Meteorology and Oceanography Facility in Pensacola, Florida, and was the 50th Superintendent of the United States Naval Observatory. And our last panelist today is retired Brigadier General Jerry Galloway, who is now a research professor and Glenn L. Martin Institute Professor of Engineering at the University of Maryland. He retired as Brigadier General before serving 8 additional years in the federal government, most of which was associated with water resource management. Professor Galloway is the former Dean of the Faculty and Academic Programs at the Industrial College of the Armed Forces and former Dean of the Academic Board for the United States Military Academy at West Point. And so, we'll begin today's session with some questions, overarching questions for our panelists, and then I'm sure we'll have time for some Q&As for our audience and a time for them to ask some questions as well. So the first question I am posing to all the panelists today, scientists are now projecting that sea level rise combined with the impacts of extreme weather events, tidal surges, and subsidence will have a significant impact on many of our coastal installations, which house critical assets for training, testing, deployments, and rapid response. In fact, many of those facilities are experiencing those impacts now. Based upon your own professional and personal experiences of the issues, can you give the audience examples of where some of the key risks lie and what those risks are now?
Well, I think from my time, since I retired in 2007, we were just on the beginning of starting to understand this. We picked up on this about 2003 and said, you know, as we rebuild our bases, because you have a certain cycle of renovating your installations, as we do that, what standard should we build to? And so you have a question of how high, how hard, and how energy efficient do you build these structures. I can remember that when I was in Langley in mid-80s, commanding a squadron of fighters there, we had certain weather events. And then when I was back in 2005 as the commander of Air Combat Command, we had a few nor'easters come through, and we had an unprecedented amount of water up on the base in areas that we hadn't had before. And we were seeing water, the high tides, coming up further on the bases than they ever had before. So those are the kind of issues that you have. You go, well, how much of this can we adapt to? At some point, you can only build the dike so high. And at some point, you're going to have to start leaking out missions. And you have to work with the communities around the bases, because although we may be able to put a wall around the base, in large measure, our people, our electricity, our fuel, our food, comes from the outside. And so this has got to be a cooperative approach to how do we minimize the ability to have our mission impeded by weather effects, which come from climate change, and is all emission going to stay there, or is it not? So those are the kind of the issues that we had just started wrestling with while I was on active duty. When I retired, I was looking at it from renewable energy. We were looking at resilience for bases. We wanted to be able to drop off the grid, still operate, because when you call, we got to answer the phone, and we've got to mobilize, we got to go. We wanted to look at that, but when you look at that bookend, and very quickly you start saying, there's another bookend of this, because renewable energy has an effect on halting climate change. I was a little standoffish on that issue, quite frankly. But then I started talking to experts and people like the insurance industry and the people that insure insurance companies. And you start saying, what do you guys think about this? What's your analysis showing? And you start to become concerned. And then you talk to the NOAA guys, and you talk to the FEMA guys, and you talk to oceanographic experts and everything. You go, this is going to be a problem for us.
General Castellano.
Well, thank you. I spent 4 tours in the Pacific and had opportunity to traverse that great geographical area. And I think one of the most prominent examples of the risk are the Marshall Islands. Had opportunity to go to Kwajalein. And those of you that may not be familiar with the Marshalls, it's an atoll. We've used it since World War II to support military operations, including testing of nuclear weapons. We've also built a tremendous range there, and it's sort of a bullseye for a lot of our missile tests, where we lob missiles and packages that land within the lagoon of the atoll. But I remember landing at the airfield at Kwajalein, and none of the islands, the islets, are more than 6 feet above water level. And that 6 feet is already being compromised. You can look at photographs and see where the erosion is taking place as events are getting more intense. You're seeing the level continue to rise. And why there's 2 impacts that are readily apparent. The first impact, of course, is the threat to the facilities there. 2007, when I was still on active duty, had a water intrusion that destroyed all of the fresh water on Kwajalein, and that had to be reestablished. So there is a threat to that significant infrastructure that we have put there. But there's also a risk to the population. There's something like 70,000 people who occupy the Marshall Islands. We employ in a little islet north of Kwajalein about 700 who each day come on a ferry on Kwajalein to help run the operations. And when you look at those locations at the buildup, you can see how their life is being impacted as the water rises and starts eroding their facilities, their homes, their schools. Majuro, which is one of the islands, had a school that was had to be used as a place to put folks in that were dispossessed because of the water intrusion. So that there is those two elements, the human element and the risk to our facilities that support our national interest. And it's something that's readily apparent. You can see it. It's going on now. And certainly something that, as we look around the world, is one of the prime examples of the risk that climate change is generating. Thank you.
Bryce?
So let me just start out a little bit with the perspective. The Coast Guard's a little different. Since we're not in DOD, we're in DHS. We don't have a service secretary per se, because that is also the department secretary, which is both good and bad when it comes to budget battles. You're not fighting against other services. You're fighting across different lanes and missions and things with different constituencies like TSA and Customs and Border Protection and Immigration, and some topics that don't have any issue or interest at all in this particular region. So trying to fight for budget space in that makes things interesting. So it was great when Frank led off with the How to Avoid Big Ships. As a career cutterman, I can tell you that not enough people read that book. And those who did may not have taken heed. But I think the issue there really is, what's your sense of urgency for that thing that is looming and dangerous? And how do you get that sense of awareness? And I've got a couple thoughts on that I'll wrap up with at the end of the discussions here today. So my experience comes from all over. I followed my dad around, who was Air Force for a long time, and then went into the Coast Guard Academy. And when I became a cutterman, I got to go and see and do a bunch of different things, but I was primarily a West Coast person. So my first real understanding of climate change, I think, came post-Katrina in my first job as a flag officer, when our job was to go back and try to figure out how to rebuild with all the supplemental money we got the stations that were wiped out. And my first thought when I drove down there, and we drove from Biloxi, Mississippi, and just kept going, and we saw probably 15 Waffle House signs, and that was the only thing we saw. Everything else was either stripped down to the sand or was foundations. And it just struck me as very interesting that we were going to rebuild a station in a place where the only thing that survived was the Waffle House signs. If you've ever been down to, you know they're about every 3 blocks. But it really struck me as kind of ludicrous until I started getting into some of the political side of that, and to understand that we go wherever the work is. And the work in this case, because we play the home game, we're not just here preparing to go away and do things, we do that as well. But for our missions, they're here and amongst our fellow citizens. So when we looked at this and how we're doing this, we had to stay wherever the constituency was, and that became the prime driver. If the citizens were gonna stay, and they will rebuild, then we stay and figure out how to adapt our infrastructure or whatever our mode of operation is gonna be. So that sort of started the ball rolling for me a little bit. I would go forward from there to say that by the time I took over, I did a number of events down when I was at Southern Command. I was the first Coast Guard J3, J2 down there, working for Admiral Stavridis, and we did a lot of hurricane relief and disaster relief down, humanitarian assistance, disaster relief. It's usually whenever you had a hurricane, if it impacted the Caribbean, the forces you needed to get down there to do that were bugging out and going somewhere else at the same time, or they were impacted in their ability to load out. So the weather impacts on that were not lost on me at all. And then I came into the Atlantic area job, which I had for 4 years. And the first summer I was in that, we had Hurricane Irene. And every major command and control spot has a thing called a COOP plan, your contingency of operations. And very few people actually exercise these unless it's so dire that you have to go somewhere else, because you're literally ripping everything out from where you're comfortable with it. You're leaving your families behind. And then we bugged out to St. Louis and ran our hurricane efforts from there. Exactly the right call, because our headquarters in Portsmouth was underwater. Literally, the generator bed was up on the first floor, but it got flooded. The street behind is ironically called Water Street. And there's a wonderful picture of just the very top of that sign showing up above where the water level came up to. And that was a Category 1 storm that ripped through there. And then, just a nor'easter will do that actually in that Hampton Roads area. So I became very keenly attuned to those kinds of challenges as we looked at that. As I traveled around, the Great Lakes was in our region. And what I found out was, even though it was nice not to spend a lot of money breaking ice in the wintertime in the Great Lakes in order to get commerce to keep moving and keep the iron ore and steel products moving, it also meant that all those storms that blew didn't blow across the top of fast ice. They were going across water, which causes waves, which radically increased the amount of erosion we were finding. And so we had all kinds of problems with bulkheads and seawalls and piers and things that we just didn't have the money to recapitalize on the backside. And it's these sort of nips and bites and duck bites that you're getting along the way in the budget that it takes a big event in order to get the supplemental funding, which, you know, we spent more money in reconstruction with supplemental funding for our $20 billion shore infrastructure plan over 10 years by far than we did in what was in our budget. And so we've got this short notice, here it is, go fix that, and it drives you further and further away from strategic intent when you look at how you're gonna rebuild your infrastructure. And then sort of the last big hurrah I had was Hurricane Sandy. So my first experience with Sandy was our forward operating base down at Guantanamo Bay. We have a small aviation detachment down there, which took Sandy right on the chin right when it was a hurricane category 2. And it blew out the entire facility, flooded it out, and we had to bug out from there and go somewhere else. It took about 3 months to rebuild that to a functional state. So there was 3 months of loss of operation there. Then it came up and ripped through the Bahamas, which caused us some work down there. And then, as you know, it went into New York. So the day after the storm passed, we took a helicopter for 8 hours in an H-60, which I don't recommend, by the way, flying from Portsmouth all the way up through the storm path to find out and prioritize where we're going to do the reconstitution and how we're going to get our forces back and get back to serving the public. We landed in a lot of interesting places and saw a lot of really things that we hadn't seen before, piers and things in places they didn't belong. We thought about putting, you know, the fuel pier for Bayonne up in the milk carton, you know, have you seen me lately kind of thing, because there were all these parts and pieces missing that are things that you just don't expect to be missing after an event like that. The most striking thing I saw there was something that came from another event. And there's a lesson in this, because after 9/11 happened, all of our communications from New York City, so the CityNet, the thing that you drive all of your emergency communications, interagency communications for all of the forces there, not just federal, city, state, local, whatever, had been on top of the World Trade Center. When that collapsed, they said, we'll put it somewhere safe. So they moved it to the South Battery, which was like the first place that flooded when Hurricane Sandy came along. So completely shut down all the emergency communications net. So when I walked into New York, Activities New York, or Sector New York, they were literally in there. The only things that worked were cell phones and laptops, and the occasional pad of paper and pencil that went with it. When you think about working the scale of the operation, the things you needed to do at that point with, you know, the relationships rather than the infrastructure you're used to, you have to think about what's next. Our tendency is learn the lesson of the last crisis, move forward, take that, go forward, and you're always doing that in a compressed timeline, much like you do with supplemental funding. And then what happens is you rush into something without looking at it deliberately. The good news is this is a looming and burgeoning problem that has been with us for quite some time, and it's one that won't go away. The Gulf states are a big problem for us. The Mid-Atlantic region, big problem for us. The poster child for us in this case was Sandy Hook, which has a long history of being rebuilt to something different because we can't quite move out of there until it finally will be, you know, 70% underwater. But the families couldn't get back there, and then you have all the infrastructure issues, and you know the schools are wiped out, so the kids have to move somewhere else. The water's no good when you get there. The access roads, all these things that we don't think about. The other one that's really interesting when you look at these major events piled on top of sea level rise, and whether that's subduction or storms or pick another issue that compounds that, or the frequency and severity of these issues. When you have all those things compound together, what you find is that it really causes problems to all the infrastructure that would normally support you, that you go back to and lean on. So if you need to deploy forces, and whether it's Coast Guard or any other service, the port infrastructure may be gone, the fuel services are gone. All those things become part of your critical infrastructure, and I think all the services now, and I know Transportation Command is getting all over this, but these are really key assets for us for sustainability of our readiness and our military forces writ large, and the Coast Guard's no exception to that. So I was part of the decision to recapitalize Sandy Hook. I'm not sure I would make that same decision today. Admiral Fagan's in the office. She was a district commander up there, and I had a conversation with her, and I'm just not sure I'd make the same call I did then with the benefit of hindsight looking back at this. But we were rushed into this. We had money dropping in on us that had a clock on it that had to be spent. We didn't have a lot of good options of other places to go. And that's just the operational side of that, never mind the political overlay that can come with that and the challenges that are presented there. So when I talked to, before I came up here, I talked to the head of our Shore Infrastructure Logistics Command, who's a friend. I said, George, what what are you doing about this? He says, well, this is great. We're doing all these assessments. We've got this list. We're taking a look at this. We're going to go at it deliberately. And so when that happens, we're going to know what the strategic impact is. I said, so you're on this intergovernmental pilot project there in Hampton Roads, one of several that's been laid out already. How's that going? He goes, it's great. It's a good structure. It's an important thing to do, but we don't talk about the hard questions. We are not answering the hard questions. So if I have, at the end, it'll be my takeaway. You gotta talk about the hard questions before they happen if you wanna have any chance of success on the backside. But I'm pleased to be here. Thank you for the time, and thank you for your interest in your time in coming out today.
Thank you so much. General Galloway.
My naval colleague. Do you want to go first? I'll jump in.
Oh, no, I'm sorry, that was my fault. Admiral White, please.
Okay. I'll go first.
The Army is a senior service.
When was the last time you guys won a football game? Oh, never mind. We won't get into that. First of all, I would just like to say that having spent some time on a lot of bridges of big ships, I will agree with Admiral Parker that not all cuttermen have read the book. But they're a heck of a lot better than the
I haven't read it either.
They're a heck of a lot better than the sailboats and fishermen that are out there as they disappear beneath the bow, and you're wondering when the investigation is going to start, and hopefully they pop out the other side. So, which they always did in my case, or I wouldn't be here today. So I think when you look at Navy and the Navy installations, it's almost easier to say, well, what Navy bases, someone like the Coast Guard, what Navy bases aren't going to be dramatically impacted by sea level rise? Maybe we just go there. I don't know. But there have been a lot of reports, recent reports from several years ago who've talked about which installation, where, what the problems are. Everybody is well aware of the Hampton Roads and Norfolk issues and things like that. And a lot of great work is going on there. The Navy and DoD have been leaders in taking a look at this problem. So the U.S. installations, the Navy is taking a hard look. They are looking at risk. There's still uncertainty, and we can talk about that later on. But I think the other thing to point out, I think what we tried to do in the report is a little bit is to take this to the next level. It's not just about the base, or even, as was very articulately pointed out, the base and all the infrastructure around the base and the systems and the people and the roads and the water and all these kind of things that are all part of a network that is our military infrastructure. It involves a lot more than just the people in uniform, and even the people that work next to the people in uniform. But take it to the next level. First of all, what's part of our military that you don't often think about? Where are the military Sea Lift Command ships at? The ones, the logistics, like Blount Island up St. John's River in Jacksonville. So what's going to be the impact? How many days out of the year in 50 years are you not going to be able to get those ships underway, as opposed to how we can do it now? And how do you plan for that? How do you plan to respond to a crisis if you start to take into consideration the impact on readiness, the impact on my ability to train, to operate, and to respond to crisis, whether you're Coast Guard, Navy, Air Force, Marines, or Army? We got to be able to do that. So taking that to that level of planning. Then what about the other infrastructure? What about shipyards? The Union of Concerned Scientists report talked about the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard, where a lot of submarine maintenance is done, and the flooding risk and the number of days we're likely to see on the highest risk type of sea level rise scenario. The impact there. Well, what about other shipyards? We talk about Norfolk a lot. What about Newport News? What about Portsmouth, Virginia shipyard? What about Pascagoula? You guys been down to Pascagoula? I mean, it only takes about a half inch of sea level rise, and it's basically, it's pretty close to underwater now. Look at what happened in Katrina and others. We start to take a look at that infrastructure. Then take a look at other things we're not thinking about. What about our cyber infrastructure? Where are we putting our cyber systems? Where are we putting our data centers? Data center in New Orleans, for example, for the Navy, and a lot of others. So I think it's, we've got to take this to the next level of planning, not just where the installations are, but from those installations, what's the entire network across our nation, and then even across the globe. I had Kwajalein written down as well, General. You can see on my piece of paper here. So again, what are the key places? Diego Garcia is another one. Another, a strategic spot out in the middle of the ocean. We need to be able to understand what the impact's going to be there, and how do we adjust our long-term operational and strategic planning for those sites as well. And then I'll just go, on by saying there are a lot of hard decisions to make. but we've really got to understand the complexity of those risks. I look at all these bases. I was stationed at several of them. I've seen the changes. I spent a lot of time in Key West as an ensign and Lieutenant JG in the Navy back in the early to mid 80s. You know, you could fly in and out of Boca Chica Naval Air Station like that pretty much all the time. I was just down there about 3 months ago, and we had a lot of heavy rain for about a day, and the place was nearly underwater now. So now as the Navy looks and tries to make a lot of decisions, one of them ongoing is, where do I put my Triton unmanned aerial systems? Big effort on there. And the 3 bases that were chosen to actually pick from, Key West, Mayport, and Wallops Island Flight Facility. I hope that our Navy and our defense doesn't make choices, so they're like you, Admiral Parker, and saying, if I had it to do over again, would I make the same choice? And I think that's part of what we've got to address here in terms of looking at the infrastructure, at the bases at risk to the next level. So, thanks.
Thank you, sir. General Galloway.
Thank you very much. Well, the Army doesn't have many coastal installations, but the Army does provide a lot of assistance and looks to assistance and support from the other services. You can see from the report we're talking about Hunter Army Airfield, Fort Eustis, which is part of the Hampton Roads area, and we're talking about here in Washington. Imagine in 2006 we had 3 feet of water on Constitution Avenue before we really got involved with sea level rise, and the challenges in dealing with something are illustrative. How do you get something done when it's an issue that is seen by most people as the future? What they do, people walk along and you look 5, 6, 8 feet out in front of you, when in reality we're talking about somebody that should be looking out 100 yards. And I would make the comment that reconstitution is not a substitute for preparedness and implementation. It's interesting, the 2006 flood in downtown Washington, very quickly they came up with a plan to deal with that, and for the past 7 years nothing's happened with that. That's unfortunately the challenge we face in many of the military installations. I am a Corps of Engineers flood person, coastal person, and one of the things that you see is all along our coast is the issue of, okay, it's a problem, we need to talk about it, we need to get ready. Who is going to support the planning and then the implementation of the actions that may not be necessary for 15 or 20 years or 30 years, but you need to begin the planning and the process right now. We have some interesting challenges. The U.S. Army uses our military installations near the coast as launch platforms. We use the ports that are nearby, take Savannah or the airfield at Hunter. When you go to Houston, when we want to leave there from Fort Hood, you have to have these ports available to you. And if we're not prepared and they're not prepared, our colleagues, we have a real problem. And as has been emphasized before, it is not just the problem of the military in and around these military installations. Because so much of our force actually lives off base now. So many of the people that make our installations work, whether it's at Hunter or Eustis or any other military installation, live off post and have to come onto the installation. And if they're shut down, as was pointed out, they don't come to work, the schools aren't open, it's a real problem for the long term. What it really says is we need to be evaluating constantly the risk. And what the Army has tried to do is go to each of the installations, certainly on the coast, but throughout the country, and examine what the risks that are associated with what we're seeing in terms of variable climate. So we have these challenges to face, and the question is, are we doing enough about them? I would jump on what General Castlaw said. I just finished chairing a logistics study for the Army, in which one of the issues is the Pacific pivot. We always talk about, we spent the last many years working in the desert, but what if suddenly we are out in the Pacific, in the Southwest Pacific? You go back and look at the history of the actions in World War II and moving into locations that are seemingly friendly now, not hostility, but friendly from the ability to land, and you put sea level rise in there, and many of these islands and places where we have to run our logistics chains, very, very difficult to do. So the Army looks at our installations on the shore from a launch platform. The Army looks at installations throughout the country, is examining what the risk is and how do we share that risk with the neighboring communities. And the Army looks at its operations plans worldwide to see what this sea level rise will do in terms of our ability to carry out our mission.
Thank you so much for your answer. Now we're going to move on to a second question. And in the report, it says that the very strategic landscape that the services operate in is going to be vastly different from what it is like today. And the report also states that it may impact theater operations and for the maritime and safety mission of the Coast Guard. What do you perceive are the most significant risks from sea level rise on readiness, training capability, and on a larger scale, national security? General Keyes.
Well, I would just have to reiterate what we've just heard. I mean, it's all together because you have, essentially you have a basing challenge because we've got to live somewhere. We have a training challenge. We know that in a number of areas we're either affected by erosion or drought. We can't use certain kinds of weapons. We can't use certain kinds of countermeasures because we set huge fires. We know that the number of black flag days are increasing, which are those days when you don't send people out to train because they may die just because of heat stress. And then you look at around the area, the lily pads from which we mobilize and deploy. If they're affected, we're not going to be able to do that. We're going to have to back off and go somewhere else. So there has to be a plan B and a plan C. So I think it's all caught up in the same thing, that if you have a secure and resilient base, then you'll be able to, 1, live there, 2, train there, 3, mobilize there, and then 4, deploy there. And you've got to look at it from that standpoint. And then the question of, for us in the Air Force, we do a lot of reach back. We have our Reapers and Predators running. We do a lot of our intelligence reach back to certain bases, and those bases are in large major coastal bases. And we get water intrusion in there, or we lose electricity, we start to impact our ability to reach forward and exercise the mission.
Thank you. General Castello.
You know, in the Marine Corps, what we pride ourselves on is our ability to deploy today, tomorrow, whenever we're called to do that. And how we do that is because we maintain a high level of readiness. We do an awful lot of training. We try to make it as realistically as possible, and we depend heavily, particularly on our installations, to support that training. I think that what we're seeing, again, with the projected sea level rise, 3 feet, 2,100 minimum, best case, more likely, is that we can look at some of the installations that we have and see what kind of impact it has strategically on our capability to support the objectives of the United States. And I was head of Marine Aviation and did a lot of planning to bring the F-35 into the Marine Corps. Our key location on the East Coast for the F-35 is going to be Beaufort, South Carolina. Today, we have 6 squadrons of strike fighters down there. All of the strike fighters that we have on the East Coast, our plan is to eventually have 70 F-35s there, including the training organization that will train those Marines that are going to fly the F-35B, which is a short takeoff and vertical landing. And it will also not only train Marines, but it's going to train Brits and Italians, that one location. Now you look at the charts that shows what the impacts are going to be on Beaufort, where the water levels are going to impact what percentage during the year that we can see from events that will have impact on operations, on the families that live there, on the day-to-day activity that goes on. The Marine Corps depends on those aircraft to provide the fire support, ISR, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, to provide strikes, all of those things that make, what we believe the Marine infantryman to be the most lethal weapon that we have in the United States arsenal. And so when you start seeing that, and I also, I never passed Accounting 101 at UT, University of Tennessee at Martin, but they made me the money man for the Marine Corps. And so I've had the battles, in the middle of the night, somebody called me and said, how you answer this next question depends on whether you lose $5 billion or just $3. So money is very precious to us. We are on the north side of $600 million in F-35 funds that have been expended or will be expended on Buford. And as we continue to go into the era of the hot fights and cold fights are continuing, that we're going to have to recapitalize our assets, and that we have to be very careful with where and how we spend money and to support that, because it's going to continue to be scarce. So we need, to do some further risk analysis about how we do that. The most important individual in the Marine Corps is the man or woman who operates those systems. We equip the Marine, we don't man the equipment. Parris Island is located in the Buford area. It's a real practical reason it's named Parris Island, because it's an island. And it's connected to the mainland by a causeway. Over 50% of Marines, men and women, are trained at Parris Island. Over 50%. And it probably, between the two installations, both are at risk, but Parris Island is at most risk of the installations in that area. And we have significant infrastructure, and you can see what if we lose training days. The Marine Corps is pretty tight on our schedules. You can see if we lose training days, what the impact it has on us. Why? I mean, the Marine Corps is the smallest service. Why is that significant? Well, we recruit as many as the Air Force does, and the Air Force is a much larger system. We believe in a smaller career force. What we want is that man or woman that we bring in, keep them for 4 to 6 years, and they go out and serve as Marines in society. So we have to have that capability to have a large number of recruits trained. So all that, the impact on personnel training, the impact on our aviation, which is the long lance in the Marine Corps' toolbox, will have overall strategic impact, the potential to have a strategic impact on the objectives and carrying out those objectives for the United States.
Thank you, sir. Admiral Parker.
Thank you. In addition to what you've already heard, the biggest risk, I think, for the Coast Guard is just failure at mission execution. We don't have forces in garrison like the other services do. If you need to go do something, pulse somewhere else, you pull off one mission or one area, and you take those forces and repurpose them and put them somewhere else. There's no slack, there's no downtime, there's no elasticity in that readiness. So every nick that you take out of that is doubly problematic. Over the years, through various different cuts, we've consolidated training commands to where all of our officer sessions are done in one place. It's now in New London, Connecticut, at the Coast Guard Academy. We also have the reserve officer or the training corps for the NOAA folks there as well, which we pulled on from down at Kings Point. And then all of our enlisted sessions go through Cape May. Both of those sites are subject to inundation issues now. And Cape May dodged the bullet because it was south of the storm path of Sandy, but if it had been, if Sandy had cut in just a little bit further south, we'd probably still be out of business down there. So there's a lot of risk associated with that, but you're trading risk off in different places, and whether it's at readiness or mission execution, and then you got to decide what those costs are on the backside. But mission execution was a big one for us in the Coast Guard. I think the other thing that is happening, and it's an additional driver for us, is as the climate gets warmer, we see what already is a popular thing of people moving to the coast. There are more people moving closer to the water. there's higher demand on heating and cooling and all these infrastructure issues that are then further put at risk, which then adds to all the complexity of the challenges that you have when you operate in and amongst a populace. That's where your families are, and that's where you're going to operate. And then you've got all these other issues that you've got to deal with whether it's schools or the infrastructure support or your ability to protect the ports that we talked about were so important. I think the added risk to the civilian population that helps support this and the network that goes with that, and the mission failure part of that is the part that I would add for the Coast Guard for that.
Thank you. Admiral White.
Yeah, I'll just say I talked a little bit about looking at the whole Navy and military network and infrastructure. I think when we start to look at one thing that we've really got to start doing is taking into consideration the impacts of sea level rise. And as we pointed out in the report, one of our recommendations is that we must consider the highest risk sea level projection in military planning. So, credit to DOD and Ms. Becky Patton, who's sitting in the audience, that DOD put out policy that said climate change will be incorporated in all military planning, whether infrastructure, operational, strategic. So now, it's easy to say that, and that's great. So now how the services, how the individual commands implement that. And that's where we're after. They've really got to take a look at some of the highest risk type of scenarios, take a look at that risk. What is that risk? What is the risk of not just our bases, but I mentioned some of the bases that we rely on overseas, whether it's in the Mediterranean, it's in Asia. With a highest risk type of scenario, how does that impact our ability to respond to threats in the future? How does it impact our ability to respond to crises in the future? And then based on those and balancing all those risks, what are the highest risks, and therefore what are the priority investments? And this gets to the resources part. If I can only spend a few dollars, because we know we're not going to have enough money to fix everything at one time, how do I start to invest in the right decisions to balance those resources and risks so that I can take care of the highest threats, whether they are threats related to threats from other nations or individuals or organizations, or threats based on the type of other things that we have to answer to in the military, especially the Coast Guard, when we think of catastrophic situations that occur. So it's really about taking that planning to the next level outside of the Pentagon into the folks who really do the planning that makes a difference out forward.
Thank you. John.
Let me second what my colleague just said. The Navy certainly has the experience of living on the coast. The Army sees the challenges that are faced, and as I mentioned before, the issue of being able to deploy is critical. The people who lived in Waveland, Mississippi, or Biloxi didn't anticipate a 28-foot surge of water coming through and wiping them out several miles beyond the coast. Put 3 feet of sea level rise on top of that and see how much farther that goes. The people in Staten Island or at Sandy Hook or other places in this country face the same problem. 40% of our infrastructure in the oil and gas area is in the Houston area, and a major hurricane coming through there would make it very difficult for us to deploy. So how do we put all these things together? Our recommendations say this has to be done in collaboration with the local communities. It has to be part of an overall process. There's going to be competition for dollars in the years ahead. And so how do you deal with the challenges that they face in these communities along the coast, our military installations face along the coast, put them together with a plan that's going to assure that both can remain operational. Our civilian communities will remain resilient and able to deal with these challenges. At the same time, for the Army, we continue to have launch platforms for our sister services to support we need. I would emphasize again the point that overseas, we make many plans. We don't know where the next conflict is going to be. We don't know what the next challenge will be. The U.S. military is so involved in humanitarian assistance and disaster recovery activities, and where you go now looks very good. We can get in there, except with sea level rise, we may find that the next foot puts them totally out of business. So it's a matter of looking in this broad perspective of what we're going to be facing in the future and planning to deal with it now and taking those actions that will move things along so that we can deal with them. Thank you.
Thank you so much. The next set of questions are for individuals, and sometimes they're in groups as well. So the first question is for General Keyes, Admiral Parker, and Admiral White. We know now that sea level rise is occurring faster than previously predicted, and the Arctic sea ice is receding to record low levels. Why is this of major concern to the missions of the Navy and the Coast Guard, and what challenges and dangers are there for the Air Force in a warming Arctic, and what can be done to counter those impacts? General Keyes.
Well, a lot of it is just for us is the deployment of forces. You know, it's navigation up there, it's intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance up there. What do you have based, looking to see what's going on up there? Communication in the northern area. When I was stationed at Eielson Air Force Base near Fairbanks, as commander there, every year we had a search and rescue mission with the Russians, the Canadians, and us, based on the fact that if an airliner went down, we would have to get there quickly in the wintertime in a 30, 40, 50, 60 degrees below zero. So we worked on that sort of seesaw approach. But we didn't have to worry about getting into the very high north, because that was all frozen solid. No one's going to go beaming through there. Now the shipping lanes are starting to change. There are a lot more people going to be exposed. There's going to be competition for resources. So we have to understand what's going on. We have to be able to track who's up there, who's doing what to whom, and we've been able to talk to each other and to our either allies or whatever coalition forces happen to get involved in a rescue up there. I'm much less, the professional that ought to be talking about this than my Coast Guard and Navy pals here, so I'm going to stop and let them address the real answer.
Well, I'm going to use an Air Force piece there because one of the pleasures of being retired is you get to spend some time on things that really matter in life. And I spent 2 weeks here just recently taking care of my 94-year-old parents. My dad, as I said, was a fighter pilot. In the 50s, he was assigned in Fairbanks. My sister was born there, and I was doing I did a little mind map with him on his service and his time, because his memory's getting kind of bad now. And so I asked him, because I knew this was coming up, I said, so what was it like looking over all the radar stations, the DEW-line folks up there? He said, well, every year we kind of had to retreat and keep moving back because the sea kept coming and claiming more and more of that. So this is in the 50s. So this is not a new challenge or a new problem up there. It's an accelerated problem because of the amount of open water that we have up there. But it's not by any stretch new. I think what's new for us, as General Keyes mentioned, is the increased access and the competition for the resources up there. And whether it's mineral resources or living marine resources or access to transit routes and things like that, it certainly means more human activity up there, which is a regulation area that we haven't really had to worry about in the past, and that has very, very hard operating parameters. The communications, as you said, are very hard. Shore infrastructure is doubly hard because as things warm up, the things that are permafrost up there really don't help. You really can't build on that stuff. So infrastructure is problematic. When you look at all that, you really need to have a different way of looking at problem sets. So when we look at it in terms of domain awareness. How do you know what's going on there? And then how do you get presence? Because I've heard a lot of people talk to me about virtual presence, and I would argue that virtual presence is actual absence. And when you have actual absence and human activity, you don't get good things as a result when you're trying to keep folks in line, and whoever those actors might be. So the maritime governance that you need to have up there requires a certain level of awareness that we currently don't have. I think there's some interesting things like the Polar Scout program and microsatellites, getting some better sensors on there so you can get a better idea of where it is you need to go and then prioritize. It's a lot of real estate up there and not a lot of resources. And then you've got probabilistic things you can do with routes of where you're going to see people and not see people, and then you'll be able to pick anomalies so you can pick and choose and be very cautious with this precious national treasure that we have not enough of. The infrastructure is so problematic that I would argue that whatever you do up there for our missions really needs to be expeditionary. And to be expeditionary 365 days a year, you need a nice strengthened hull and the ability to get up there, which sounds a lot like a multi-mission icebreaker, which is exactly where the service is trying to go right now. They're not cheap, nor is infrastructure that you try to put up in that environment, and you don't have a lot of good help to come with that. So I think we're on the cusp of getting this right. The problem, of course, is the timeline to build those things out versus the timeline that we're presented with when that is going to be accessible and you're going to have an increased human activity up there. And we're hoping to get there before we have a crisis up there. Thank you.
So most of you have seen the commercial on television all about the Navy, and it shows these red balloons that turn into red dots around the world on where your Navy is today. It's a great commercial. I like it anyway. Other services may disagree. If you look at the globe right now and you said, where are the red dots where the Navy is, how many Navy ships do you think you'd find in the South Atlantic? None. Maybe one if we're doing a little bit of exchange work down there with some of our friends. Okay, but if we wanted to go to the South Atlantic, we could. We could be there in a hurry. The East Coast, West Coast, whatever, we could get around there and be there, and we know that we could get there and operate. We know how to operate. We have the equipment, the machinery, that people understand it. If we had to go there, we could. How many dots do we have in the Arctic right now? Well, there might be a submarine up there, and you won't see a dot on there because we don't want to tell you where the submarines are. But if we had to go to the Arctic, could we? And the answer is maybe a little bit. We could be darn sure we knew where the open water was, or if we had the Healy or the Polar Star or somebody in front of us at all times so we could make sure we stay out of the ice conditions. But we're not really Arctic capable as a Navy right now, not totally. Pieces and parts are, certainly our submarine force, a lot of the aviation capabilities, but to be the type of Navy that you want to have anywhere, basically anywhere in the world at any time, if it's needed, then we've got work to do. We got work to do as a nation. Navy, Coast Guard, all of us here, all of our services. So when we think about that, the question then comes in, well, when do you want to have a Navy that's capable? You don't want to be early to need because it's going to be really expensive. It's not just the shore infrastructure, it's ship infrastructure, it's people infrastructure at sea. So when is that? You don't want to be early and you sure as heck don't want to be late, or some other nation might just own the Arctic in their own mind, so we've got to make sure we understand the timing. In order to do that, one of the key things we've got to do is to keep investing on the science of understanding what is going on. What is going on with our ocean, what is going on not just with the sea ice, but the glaciers and the ice sheets up there which are driving our sea level rise. We need to try to keep reducing the uncertainty so that we can make the right decisions at the right time. So the DoD's not going to invest, they're not going to solve all the science problems. I know a lot of people that belong to universities, some in this room would say, we'd love the Navy to spend more money in research, and they're not going to be able to do that. They have a lot of needs, but they can certainly, and the other services can help demand for the right investments in the right science at the right times. The other thing that I will just leave you with on that note is that you can't just wait for the science as well. I learned when I worked for General Keys about 18 years ago now, and we were planning combat operations in Serbia and in a little place called Kosovo, that if you don't make decisions and take action and you're waiting for the right answer, you're going to sit around wringing your hands. And there was a lot of that going on in Washington, D.C. while we were out there in Stuttgart trying to take some right actions. And luckily, we were able to do that. We can't just wring our hands and do nothing. We've got to respond, we've got to act, we've got to decide now, and then we've got to demand the science to make sure that we're making the right decisions at the right time.
Thank you so much. General Castaway, this question is for you. According to recent studies performed by DoD, one of the locations in the world that will experience the greatest sea level rise from ice melt will be in the Pacific. From your perspective, how will this impact the rebalance in the Asian Pacific theater, and what do you believe could help the department mitigate those impacts?
You know, I always love how we come up with how we refer to things, rebalance, to pivot, and so forth. You know, we've had tremendous interest in Pacific since Admiral Perry, a good sailor, with Marines aboard, opened up Japan to economic trade in the 1850s. You go on, and our expansion in the early 1800s, our involvement in that area, China, before World War II, and then the tremendous amount of effort that we expended during World War II. It was primarily an American show in the Pacific. And since that time, the Pacific rim particularly has been of tremendous importance to us. I think right now about 40% of the economic activity that's covered by the Trans-Pacific Trade Pact that's proposed is in that area. If you look at over the years what we've done in terms of infrastructure, we have bases and facilities and areas that would occupy an area 21 times the size of the District of Columbia, 21 times. And they're spread everywhere from Alaska to Singapore to Diego Garcia to American Samoa. We're starting to generate a footprint in places like Australia again. And so all of this supports what is a tremendous strategic interest in that area. And then you start to see the rise of potential competitors like China having to deal with the rogues like North Korea. You see how important it is that 21 DC equivalents are important to us, and that we ensure that we maintain them and sustain them and do the right thing on that. Tremendous strategic interest on doing that. So I think how we're going about that is, is we're looking at how we can actually sustain those locations, whether it's infrastructure improvement that we're going to have to consider in terms of the risk, where we locate those facilities. All of those have got to be a part of our risk analysis and how we plan for the future. It's a tremendous challenge that we have to come to grips with, and it's going to cost money. But what kind of dollar value are you going to put on continuing to support that strategic interest? I'm a farmer. I told my wife when I graduated, brand new wife from UT Martin with a degree in agriculture and a commission in the Marine Corps, I said, honey, 3 years and we're back on the farm. Took 36. But also a part of our security is economic trade. One of the few areas with Asia, in particularly, that we have a positive trade flow is in agriculture. We ship $40 billion more than we take into the United States to that area, and that contributes to our national security, our economic well-being. It also provides a capability to ensure that folks around the world are fed, and that we don't create those areas of instability that come from that. So, those are the type of things that we're going to have to consider in terms of our strategic interests in the Pacific.
Thank you so much. General Galloway, this is a question I'm posing to you at this point. You had mentioned earlier today that the Army is seeing impacts from climate change, from severe weather events, and on training as well, and training infrastructure. From your perspective, are there measures the department can take to position itself in terms of planning and construction criteria and adaptive management?
Yes, I think they can. I want to make a comment about the Arctic first. Interestingly enough, the people in the Arctic want to live there. The natives that are there want to be there. And one of the towns that certainly got a lot of attention is Shishmaref. And the Corps of Engineers had a program to go in there and help them stay there, build barriers to keep the sea level rise and the temperature rise from impacting their life. A couple of weeks ago, Shishmaref voted to relocate. They can't fight nature. And there's a message there that gray infrastructure, building, may not always be the solution. There may not be a way to stay where you are under all circumstances. And that carries over to the military right now in the continental United States. Bless their souls, the Department of Defense has been very active in helping the services identify what the risks they have are. The next challenge, and the military sees these, both on the base and off the base, something as simple as saltwater intrusion. As sea level comes up, saltwater intrusion gets into the water supply system, and where, just as was noted, more people are moving to the coast, we're competing for that fresh water supply in and around our military installations. High intensity storms. Who would have thought about Baton Rouge? That's amazing. What would that do to some of our communities, both on and off base? The heat effect on the Army is an extremely big one. The heat effect here in Washington, D.C. is a big one, where you see this increased temperature puts training at a damper. It may mean moving people, thinking a new way. The important part that I think the Army has discovered is it requires you to continuously assess the risk because it's always changing, identify what are the challenges you're going to face in the future, and they will change. And that's where you have to begin to be adaptive. So you have to plan for the future. You have to begin taking actions that give you the flexibility to take alternative courses if it doesn't turn out that way. If in fact there's a sudden spike or there's a sudden drop off. But you need the support to do the planning, and then you need the support to do the first steps of implementation. Every time a building is built, someone ought to consider what's the impact of the changes we're seeing on that particular installation. Certainly on the coast, that's the case. An interesting example is the president issued an executive order on federal flood risk management standards. And the president said in this is that we no longer can have a standard when the federal government invests its money in having a 100-year elevation for buildings to stay out of the floodplain. We're going to either go for 2 or 3 feet more than the 100-year, we're going to go for a 500-year elevation, or we're going to have climate-informed science. That's going to be a challenge for everybody here in this city, but at every military installation. And the question is, will the DOD respond? Will the DOD frequently says, well, we're defense and we don't need to do that? That's not the way it is. Nature doesn't understand that it's a DOD installation versus, say, a civilian installation. So it'll be important that we all are on the same sheet of music as we move forward. And fortunately, I think that DOD is moving in that direction, giving support to the realization that climate change is a problem and the sea level rise is a problem and the associated effects are a problem.
Thank you so much. Yes.
And I'd like to make just a comment on, the way I think DOD looks at this. We're great on deliberate planning, contingency planning, and crisis action planning. You start with a deliberate plan, you think through the risk, then you go to the contingency. Something doesn't quite pan out, so now we're going to plan B, and then they have the crisis. Something happens that perhaps you weren't positioned on the right foot. So the question you always have is, as General Schwarzkopf said years and years ago, in one of his books on leadership, he says, everybody knows what the right thing is to do. The hard thing is doing it. And that's where we are now. We're to the point that, this is not a political question. This is not a liberal or conservative question. This is a science question, and we need to understand the science. And then the military, when they look at a problem, they go, how bad could it be? Could I stand that? If I can't stand it, what could I do to get it back to something I could stand? Then as I take that action, how will I know it's working? How will I know it's not working? Because I don't want to get to the off-ramp to plan B and be past that when my low-level light comes on and I'm out of gas. So we take a very pragmatic approach is, what if we're wrong? And I think I get a lot of argument that says, well, we don't believe in climate change. And my answer always is, well, what if you're wrong? What if it's real and we don't do anything? Where will we end up? What if I'm wrong, or the body of 99% of the scientists around the world, what if they're wrong and we start taking some of these actions? How will we know that we're wrong? And even though we were wrong, we have invested into making bases more resilient. They'll be better against the higher class storms that are sure to come, just normally, even if there is no climate change. The water supply will be protected. It'll be cleaner. The air will be cleaner. So you have to look at what's the downside, what's the upside, and then what's the cost. We can't force our country into depression. We can't force it into recession. We can't bankrupt the Department of Defense and do it focusing just on one thing. So those are the kind of issues that I think we're approaching now. We've got the science pretty much in hand. Now it's a question of, let's say a base, the water gets ankle deep. Well, can I stand that? Can I just slosh around occasionally, ankle deep water? Maybe so. But if you're ass deep to a tall shrimper in water, that's an entirely different problem there. And if I get nuisance flooding once a week at high tide, and it's not all of my base, that's one thing. But if I get nuisance flooding twice a day for 3/4 of the days in the year, that starts to be a problem. So we have to look at it from that standpoint and say, what can we stand, what can't we stand, how much would it cost? And the real tough answer is going to be, in some cases, we're going to get to a point where we go, that is going to cost a lot, and it's probably not going to work, which means we're going to have to move to high ground. And that's going to be an interesting discussion on the Hill, when you start pulling stuff up and taking mission content out because it can't survive any longer. So those are the, that's the challenge. I think DOD is taking a very pragmatic approach to this to make sure they've got their act together so they don't get funding pulled because they want to go down a certain road and someone says, well, you can't spend the money on that. They don't have enough money to go around anyway, and so they need to be very practical in how they approach this. So I think that's the question that we're to now. You've heard of the discussion that there's a lot of impact around the world. We see that impact. It's happening even now. And so now the question is, what do you do? How much does it cost? How do you know it's working? And what do you do if it's not?
Thank you. Thank you so much. Would the other panelists like to comment on this?
I would just have one thing to say. I was born within a mile of the ocean. I've lived within 5 miles of the ocean almost my entire life. However, during high school, I went back and lived in Tennessee, in Clarksville, Tennessee, and I had a summer job working at the Rod and Gun Club at Fort Campbell, Kentucky. I spent a lot of my time mucking out stables at the Rod and Gun Club at Fort Campbell. Maybe that's why I'm at Navy in my back. See, going through my Navy career, probably the job that most reminded me of mucking out stables at Fort Campbell, Kentucky was being involved in a BRAC process, base realignment and closure. And I think I still haven't gotten the stink out, to be honest with you. However, it is a process about how we make in our military and our defense and our nation some big decisions about what to do about some of these base things. So I think as we look at the future, will we have another BRAC? I don't know. And I'm not advocating for a climate change sea level BRAC right now, by gosh, no. But I think as we look at the hard decisions that General Keyes just brought up and what are we gonna do about bases, at some point, if you look at the sea level rise projections, we may not be able to maintain a naval academy at Annapolis. You got a chance. So, if those type of decisions are gonna be made, I think we've got to make sure that we start thinking about the realities of sea level rise and other climate impacts on our base infrastructure and our base how we do make the right decisions, and understanding, hopefully, if we go through another BRAC process at some point in the future, whether I'm still alive or not, that we're taking into consideration climate change and certainly the climate science that goes with it.
Thank you so much. General Casserlaw or Admiral Parker, do you care to comment at this point on the basing? Oh, no, okay.
If I could add one
Yes,
thing,
please.
I think for us, because our missions are so impacted by climate change as well, first thing we've got to do is figure out where our missions are going to be in the same time horizon, and then how those are impacted and how we would execute those perhaps differently before we roll back into just assuming that what we're going to have, because the assumptions you do in this are critically important, and ours aren't static by any means. And if you look back in our brief history as an organization for a couple hundred years, they've changed fairly dramatically over time. There's some constants there, but how we execute that can be very different. So I would start with missions and then go up to the next level. I think the other thing you have to do here, and we're learning this, in order to get to the hard decisions, you have to have regional constructs to get all these different players together in this very, very complex thing. And then you have to talk about the hard questions and answer the hard questions as you go along. I'm seeing no shortage of instructions. I'm old enough to remember what a computer punch card is. I see at least 2 of you in the room are as well. And on the bottom of that, there was a little thing that said, do not fold, spindle,
Or mutilate.
Or mutilate. And for the longest time, I wasn't exactly sure what spindle was, but that's where you roll it up in a little rod. And the reason for that was, it's much like instructions. As an operator, I found that there was a frighteningly small number of instructions and policy guidance that wasn't intended to be rolled up and spindled and jammed in your eye after you screwed up, rather than actually help you when you were in the planning and execution phase. So whatever guidance we give, I would offer that if you need that urgent moment, You have to get that balance right to where the person on the other end is actually going to be using that and driving with that and be the bacon side of bacon and eggs, committed to that, not like the chicken that's just interested and contributing. You have to be committed to that course of action in order to get all the way to the end. It's hard to do with the uncertainty of the science and the data that we have. So there's a foundational piece to this to keep driving towards good science and data to get us there. But for us, it has to start with the missions and then fold forward on how we're going to execute those. Thank you.
Joan, could I jump in with something about academics? What's interesting is you've heard my fellow panelists, almost to the man, talk about their early life and what they did and how that influenced their later service and what they thought about the world around them. It is terribly important that the young people today understand global climate change, they understand sea level rise, and understand what impact that's going to have on them. Because they are the people that we'll have at the Naval Academy, the Military Academy, the Coast Guard Academy. They are the future service leaders, but they're also the people that are over in the building there appropriating the money. And if people don't understand and don't take this seriously at all levels, not only within the Department of Defense, but within the nation as a whole, the challenge of sea level rise, then it's going to be very difficult for the young people to grow up and take the very enlightened approach that you see on my colleagues to the right.
Thank you so much. I think we have time for one last question before we open the floor to the audience for their questions. And I'm posing this to each one of you for some brief answers. If there's one point or takeaway that you would like to make to the audience as well as policymakers today concerning sea level rise, what would that be? General Case.
Well, I think the science is settled. It's now to get on with the programmatics and the budget and start making those risk assessments of what can we do and when do we need to do it and how much needs to be done. So it's time to start doing instead of talking.
Thank you. General Castello.
In the Marine Corps, we're proud to, once we recognize a mission, that we do our analysis and we start executing. I think the mission is clear, the analysis supports it. We have over 70% certainty that this is happening, and now what we need to do is execute. And I think this is what the panelists say.
Thank you. Admiral Parker.
I'm in violent agreement. Get her done is where we've got to go. I think the challenge, of course, though, becomes how inclusive that is and how complex that is as you're doing that. I think you need to keep exploring the science. I agree that we're at a point of decision here, and as an operator, I was always interested to get academics in the discussion because they'd want to wait until it was perfect, and I would move out without them, and they'd be very, very anxious. When we bugged out of Norfolk, Dr. Rick Ludick down in UNC Chapel Hill had a beta program that was way better than what National Weather Service had at the time in the National Hurricane Center. And that told me that I was going to flood out, and I left based on that. He was apoplectic. He could barely breathe. He just didn't want to. He didn't want to have to take action on that because it wasn't complete. We're at a point of action. I'd agree. From an operational standpoint, we don't have the luxury of sitting around doing nothing. And the ostrich approach in this case will serve not only to expose our tender pits like it normally does, but we may just drown the ostrich with sea level rise. So we've got to get it.
I wanted to say thank you, but I'm not sure I want to see that picture. Admiral White.
Again, just to sort of pile on here, to badly misquote Charles Darwin, it's not the strongest that survives, not the strongest species, but that is the most responsive to change. The evidence of change is clear, and we need to really start responding, taking action. And I think that's really the imperative that we've all want to make sure is put forward in our voices in this report.
Thank you. General.
We live in a world where we reward disasters. We give people money once the disasters occurred to reconstitute. We know that every dollar you spend on mitigation brings back $4 in rewards later on. We've got to start thinking of what is it that we can do now that will make it far less difficult when we have something come up that we didn't expect. So think ahead and start working on it.
Thank you so much. I think our panelists have done a superb job today. But now what I would like to do is offer the audience a chance to ask questions. And if you could stand and give your name and your affiliation before you ask your question, that would be a wonderful thing. Thank you. Yes, sir.
My name is Bruce Molnia. I'm a marine geologist with the. Yeah, my name is Bruce Molnia. I'm a marine geologist who has worked in the Arctic and the Antarctic for many, many years. Almost all of the examples that you've talked about, other than the nuisance flooding, are not climate change. They're extreme weather or the associated storm surge that goes along with that, which is definitely a problem, but it's a reality that sea level's been rising now for almost 250 years since the end of the Little Ice Age and will continue to rise. How do you differentiate how you respond to these extreme weather and storm events, which are doing most of the damage, and this continuing but very, very low background level of ongoing sea level rise?
Are there any members who would like to address that?
I'll jump on that. I would offer that at the tactical and operational level, we don't. Because you're responding to what it is that the cues are around you. And if you live in the bayou in Louisiana, it's hard to tell what a flooding day is and isn't unless your dock is flooded or your house has got water on the carpets. It's a different environment when you bring it up to the policy level, because our drive here is to get into a deliberate planning mode, which is our comfort zone as military officers and former military officers. To get to know and drive down the uncertainty, and then have courses of action and branch and sequel plans that you can get down after that. The science looks new to us. Perhaps it's not. Your point is well taken. But what we know is that the impacts are undeniable, and that we have to do something different. Status quo just doesn't work. Which is why, to us, I don't care what the driver is. It's better to understand that. But we're at the point of action here, and we know we've got to go.
I'll just weigh in very quickly. I appreciate that's a very good scientific perspective. When we take a look at something like a storm surge, what is the water level going to be at the house at the installation? It's based on what the tide is, and then on top of the tide, what is the wind blown level of water? What are the other effects, pressure, these kind of things as well. When we take a look at sea level rise, we know that it's been rising, but what's the change in rate? Is it rising? How much faster now? And that's where we get into lowest, medium risk scenarios. How much greenhouse gases are we? How much of that are we going to actually pour into the atmosphere? So when we take a look at the risk, we've got to actually consider that. What is happening to our long-term sea level rise? That part of the equation. But then on top of it, what are the likely scenarios, the highest risk scenarios based on the installation and vulnerabilities? What do we need to plan for when we take a look at our response and readiness? And that's why understanding that whole curve in each little factor of the equation of what's the likely water level, what's the impact, and what do I need to do about it. And it gets back to, again, some of the investment in science as well.
Next, let's
Hi, I'm Sophie Robinson. I'm one of the filmmakers of The Age of Consequences, which we'll show later today. In Q&As for the film, sometimes we're asked, why isn't there 100% acceptance from the military about the consequences of climate change? I mean, all of you are, in agreement about that, but as a whole, why isn't there 100% agreement? Where's the disagreement? And is there a relationship between rank and acceptance of the risks?
Well, I think, when I was a young captain flying F-4s, my concern was, for example, am I flying today, and am I flying tomorrow, and if not, why not? I mean, that's what I'm focused on. Now, on the other hand, if I'm not flying because I'm flooded out, then my question to my boss is, well, why are we flooded out? Why didn't you do something about it? So it's a matter of the level of responsibility and what you're supposed to be ready for. I don't think there's a big disagreement. I mean, it's just if I'm Airman Keyes, I'm not focused on that unless I happen to be a power engineer on base and the generator bank is flooded out. Then I'm concerned about why, and then I want someone working on it. Now there can be disagreement about, well, how fast is this happening? There can be disagreement about which bases should we focus on. I mean, that's a good, healthy discussion to bring all of those factors in. So I don't feel like, since I've been involved since I retired since 2007, going around the country and talking to people, I think there's much more agreement than there is disagreement, certainly on the military side. Part of it is there are, when you're a base commander, you hate to be forced into doing something with your limited budget that you hadn't planned on, and someone has given you a mandate now to do something that you're not entirely comfortable with, and they can give you more money. So now I have to take money from somebody else. And in some cases, you would like to be able to have a bank, a telephone, and have all these people that are giving you mandates and give them each other's phone numbers so they can argue about where the money is going to come from. So I think that's the issue, and I think it's a healthy debate.
When I was a captain, like General Keyes, my attitude was a little different too. The only time I ever thought I had too much gas in the airplane was when I was on fire.
Yeah.
Then I really dumped it. But our attitudes have changed. I think the senior officers' attitudes have changed. I know the youngsters have changed, the men and women who are coming up now. My son is in that generation. He grew up with the thoughts about the environment, about sustainment, about climate, all of those things. And so I think particularly the youngsters are. But as we find out in our day-to-day activities, there's always going to be at least 10% that are going to have divergent views. We have that in the military, we have that in society. But I think one thing that we as a military bring to it is that we have a very methodical, measured practice approach to doing what we call intelligence preparation of the battlefield, of looking at the factors, environmental, cultural, you name it, that impact on it. And I think as we continue to refine our planning among the older folks that maybe didn't get it to begin with, that realization is permeating through there. So I just don't think the numbers are still there that they were when General Keyes and I were young studs flying airplanes.
Thank you.
And these are complex and decisions that have far-ranging decisions. And this is a very familiar landscape for us in the decision-making world when we were wearing uniforms. Very rarely did you have complete agreement on anything. So I think we're actually more in agreement on this particular issue up and down the ranks than we are on a lot of other issues. Certainly on port calls when you're the captain of a ship. It's not something you vote on, let's just put it that way. So I would offer a couple things. One is Admiral Zukampf, the current commandant, was just in Greenland a couple weeks ago. He got to see the actual rush of water coming out of the ice cap there. He gets it, but that's one of the experiences you get by being at the pinnacle of the organization that not everybody gets to see. And the more time you spend in the service, the more perspective you have, the greater appreciation you have for the complexity, and the more things you get to see and appreciate. So the challenge then becomes getting the right communication out, because what the boss finds interesting, the troops find fascinating. So again, you can publish whatever you want, but it's a matter of where do you keep querying, where do you keep asking questions, and if you have to ask and answer a lot of questions on a lot of other topics, all of that enthusiasm and focus gets diluted back down. And I think that's more what you see when you think about disagreement on this case. I think when you talk private loot folks, they may disagree about which science you're going to use or whatever, but I think everybody understands it's going to impact them in some tactical way.
Questions?
Peter Moreno with the Metropolitan Society for International Affairs in New York City. Obviously, climate change doesn't care what country is where on the globe, and we have treaty allies and partners all over the place. How much of the consensus represented here on the panel exists among our treaty allies and partners, and how far advanced are they in addressing their own challenges with climate change, and how will that affect our ability to work with them, and just generally what is the status of all that?
Take one quick. I am pretty amazed at the level of agreement by militaries around the world that this is a problem. 2 examples. A couple of years ago, we had the International Maritime Meeting of Navies, of the Chiefs of Navies up in Newport, Rhode Island. We had 70 Chiefs of Navies from around the world there. One of the presentations was by Dave Titley back there on climate change. That was the most well-attended most and people paid attention more than any other presentation during those 2 days in Newport, Rhode Island. And they asked more questions and they were more concerned. And Dave Tiltley had a line of 4 stars that wanted to talk to him. And since then, I know he, as well as I, a couple of times have been invited to go talk to other navies about a lot of these things. That gives you an indication of how serious it is. I got visited in the Pentagon by an Army general and a Navy admiral from Bangladesh, who really wanted to make sure that the U.S. military understand their problems in Bangladesh related to sea level rise. So my message is, I think in a lot of ways, a lot of those navies, they're certainly on par, if not even actually in front of us, in looking at climate change as a threat and something they've got to take into consideration. So it's an international team effort as far as I'm concerned.
There's a little think tank in town called the American Security Project, ASP, founded by John Kerry and Chuck Hagel, bipartisan. They have done a lot of work. If you go to their website, ASP, they have done a lot of work on what's going on in the militaries and other nations. I'd recommend that to you.
Thank you so much. I think we have time. Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. This on? Yes. Dave Condino, and I work as a civilian with the Coast Guard, and I work on a lot of these issues that we're talking about today in the as far as facilities and resilience and infrastructure issues and Arctic issues. So, referring to Mr. Femia's remark about collision avoidance and avoiding that big ship that's called climate change, which we see on the horizon, and thanks for all of your comments. I think we're all understood. It's coming our way, and we're on a collision course. Rule 8 of the International Collision Regulation says action to avoid collisions. Make them in ample time, make them positive and large enough to make a difference, to be effective. Arguably, we have ample time. My question is, when are we going to make that big course change? I don't think I've seen it yet, and perhaps you agree or not. But if we haven't made it, when are we going to make it, and what might that course change look like? Thank you.
I love the metaphor as a ship driver and somebody who used to teach nautical science. To me, there's a tipping point there that we have not yet reached, and others may disagree, but I don't think we've hit the tipping point on this particular case. I think the tipping point for this one, to me, comes when you can put aside local issues, constituency issues, partisan issues, and it gets us to the point where we have to talk about national security. I don't want to wait for that point, because our experience there is we put up the crossings after there's a train wreck. I'd like to know, we have pretty good indications that this is a danger spot. I'd like to do something deliberate in advance, and I think that's where we are now. So we're trying to avoid whatever the thing is and get past the tipping point, and maybe accelerate to a tipping point, or not have to get to the tipping point to make the decisions. We understand we're against very hard odds when you're competing against all kinds of different new threats, and cyber and other things that are really drawn in a lot of our precious resources off in different places. They're important things to get after. They're urgent. They're important. But it's, again, which quadrant are you in there? This one's approaching that upper left quadrant now.
Thank you so much for the answers. And it looks like we're running out of time in our question and answer session. So I would like to thank our panelists for the time, for the report. I think it was an excellent panel discussion we had today. And I thank you for the audience comments and your time. So let's give our panelists a hand.
All right.